This is where I come from. I have, for the last 12 years, led the hub in the UK that looks at biomass and bioenergy. A huge amount of that is about fuels. And so that's where I come from, really. I work on fuels and low-carbon hydrocarbons that we can use in different ways. When you do that, you inevitably have to cross-compare. And you have to look at how good would it be if instead we went down the route of electrification. And when I say fuels, I'm including work that we do on hydrogen, work that we do on ammonia, on a whole host of other things. I don't just work on land-based stuff. I've done a lot of work on aviation, doing work on aviation standards at the moment with IATA. And I lead the policy unit for the Clean Maritime Hub. So I'm interested in how we efficiently can have the hydrocarbons that we think we need and how we deploy them strategically when we're looking at what we need to do for carbon emissions for 2050. And the transport sector is not doing particularly well. Those are the figures for just last year for electricity. We're getting up to 46% in renewables, heat 9.4%, transport 6%. It is the worst of the bunch, and that is why there is a lot of effort being focused on it. For all what it might seem and feel, and possibly in your sectors is, in terms of ramp up of electrification, ramp up of batteries, ramp up of electric vehicles, I think the figures for last year were that 2.1% of the fleet was electric. I may have got that wrong, but it's a really small number. And it's not growing at anywhere near what is needed, if that is the thing that we are banking on. I'll put this up for comparison. This is renewable energy in the UK, 2023, so not quite up to date, but we haven't got the newest figures yet until after March. And on the left-hand side, you can see all the different forms of renewable energy that come into the UK. From solar PV up the top, that little slither, down to a little slither at the bottom on liquid biofuels. And there are some surprises in there. We import a load of biomass. That's interesting. We use a lot of waste material. We use a lot of hydro. But if you look over the right-hand side, what you can see is that so far to date, for UK PLC, we've mostly turned lots of this stuff into electricity. Now that's okay up to a point, but the last figures that I saw said that if we pursue our plans for electrification of heat, electrification of transport, and electrification of just about everything else we can get our hands on, we're looking at having a grid. And that means a renewable electricity capacity supporting that grid of something like 3 times the size it is today. To do that in the timescale we have is not impossible, but it requires a hell of an effort. It requires a lot of investment, and the main point I'm going to make to you today is it requires a plan. Now, I've read the NESO report, which came out about 2 months ago. I don't see a plan in there for getting to 3 times where we are today in terms of capacity. I don't see a plan that gives us those things we claim we want up the top: diversity, resilience, security, efficiency. And I think we need a plan. So the other reason for showing you this is the sheer diversity of stuff down the left-hand side when we look at electricity. There's loads of different things coming in, but there's one vector. Everybody agrees what the electricity is. We know the voltage, we know the standard, we know the frequency we're working to. No one argues with that. The transport sector is totally different. Even today, I can walk to a petrol station and I can get my fuel in different forms, or I can have electricity. If I'm really lucky, I can get compressed natural gas or LPG, but I can't routinely, there are a few exceptions, I can't routinely go and get hydrogen. And the difference between what we've done quite successfully in electricity and what we're now facing in transport is not about the decarbonisation. It's about the infrastructure change that we are facing. And if there's ever anywhere where you need a plan, it's infrastructure. And that is what I feel our gap is at the moment. There are different ways of decarbonising. If you look this up tomorrow, next week, whenever, online, you'll see it's a mechanism that we've put in place in the national programme that I lead that allows us to compare things. It allows us to look at doing the same thing, producing the same fuel, the same vector in different ways. And what it does is it takes lots of parameters. It takes things that are to do with the environment, things that are to do with economic growth, things that are to do with societal acceptability, and things that are to do with infrastructure and what we need. And it allows us to look at different options for decarbonising. And if I put this simply, everywhere where you see a green, there's a potential benefit. There's something we can do to decarbonise where, let's say, the air quality would be better than it is today, or the land use would be better. Whatever it is, it would be better. The red things are risks. Maybe we're losing jobs in the UK. Maybe we're paying more at the pump. What you find when you pan out and you take the helicopter view on this is that there are no silver bullets. If I were to do this for electrification, hydrogen, methanol, ammonia, what you would see is that there are pros and cons of all of these. And what we have to do is to try and put together an enabling framework that allows each of these to deliver what it can. And that's what we tried to do a little bit in the DFT's Science Advisory Council. Now, last year, we published a report. We sat down in a room last March with representatives from the industries and the renewables sector, and we went through lots of discussion. It was a really great day. We had a really energetic time. We had the chief scientific advisors there from the relevant departments as well. And then we had to write a report. And the report took, I think, 7 months to get published. You can find it. If you go to DFT's website, the SAC has its own page, and you'll find this report on there. It is beyond boring in the form in which it has been written. That is not what it was like on the day. On the day, one of the trade association people came over to me at lunchtime and said, I felt like going whoop this morning when we finished that session. We finally got it. That's not how this reads. But let me take you through and try and get you a little bit excited about some of the key points in there. What we concluded is that there are batteries, there's electrification options, and there are low carbon fuels, a whole host of them. And actually, we need both. Those are going to co-evolve. Now, this particularly fits with what government would like to say, because government will tell you that they do not like picking winners. They would like the market to decide. And that's sort of okay when you've got lots of different ways of producing the same thing, electricity. I still think this breaks down when you've got lots of different ways of producing, electricity or hydrogen, or, they're just totally different. We've got to get the enabling that allows us to pursue each of those on an equal playing field if we actually want to let the market decide. So first of all, we said, actually, you can't do this with one or the other. If you look at the trajectory between now and 2050, you need both. And there isn't enough evidence at the moment on what the constraints are. When do we hit that maximum grid piece? How do we cope with the demands of the timing of charging for all of these? And how do all of those pan out in the carbon emission savings? Because the reality of some of the electrification, and we were just having a discussion before we came in here about recycling of batteries in transport sector and what's going on in different countries in the world. And the reality of a lot of this is we're offshoring the emissions. So it's okay to have an electric vehicle because actually we don't build any of them in the UK anyway, very few. So we need to be really careful about where the carbon emissions are actually taking place, looking over the life cycle, are these real? And therefore, the difference between the national accounted carbon emissions in this country and the reality across the globe. One of the things that has really become more prominent in the last few months is the importance of supply chains. The geopolitics on this is huge. And therefore, having access to the right supply chains for what we need is incredibly important. I've put a quote in here from that report. We talked about opportunities a lot. We talked about the opportunity associated with reuse of the existing national infrastructure. Let's not reinvent the wheel. We do have a national grid. We do have a national gas grid. We do have existing pipelines for transport fuel, and working those into our plan and how we actually implement that in a way that makes best use of them is really important. I put the full quote in here to try and give you a flavour of this, but the balance of energy sources is not predictable. It's going to jump up and down in the coming decades if we're following this least cost market will decide rule. And the optimum between electrification and other fuels is going to depend on price, yes, but it depends on a whole load of other things as well. And one of the things that we think is the most significant here is the capacity of the UK to generate low carbon electricity. Now, we have a new government who have announced that by 2030 we will have clean power. If you delve into that, it's a bit difficult to work out how much clean power we're planning and whether they have anticipated growth in the demand within that and whether that is going to be enough to fuel any transport ambitions. But I think there's a thing here as well about different sectors. And where electrification is most appropriate, we need to be looking at transitioning to that faster than in other sectors. And in order to get the full carbon emissions piece sorted by 2050 in a least cost way over all of those decades, we need to be a lot more strategic than we are at present. So we made a number of recommendations in this report on the wider enabling framework, the things that we think you need to have in place if you then set it loose and say, let the market decide whether it's electricity, hydrogen, or anything else. We said that we needed a common metric for greenhouse gas emissions. We did some work a few years ago with the aviation sector and unpicked the fact that the incentives which are in place by the UK government for aviation fuels don't count carbon in the same way as they are counted for the land-based sector, and definitely don't count it in the same way as they are counted for electricity. That means that you end up shepherding resources, be they solar, be they biofuel or anything else, into the sector which has the most attractive regime, rather than the sector where you actually are going to get the most carbon savings. So we need to simplify that. We need to count carbon in one way, and we need to do that consistently across all of the incentives. We need to be really careful of efficiency. That graph I showed you previously of all those renewables coming in on the left-hand side, the most shocking thing on that graph is, look at it again when you get time, the grey bit coming down the right. They are losses in the system. They are the renewable energy that we have generated and then we throw away because we're not using it efficiently. So we've got to have resource efficiency thought through in this piece. We've got to have real-world verification of the non-CO2 emissions. Hydrogen is a greenhouse gas. Any slippage of that contributes to climate issues. There are all sorts of air quality issues in there. NOx emissions from combustion of hydrogen, ammonia slip, all of these things are incredibly important. But the batteries too, we've got to look at this on a life cycle basis. There's been a lot of attention on electric vehicles and whether they're really saving carbon up to the first 5-6 years of use. And there are lots of, again, different ways of running those calculations. I spent most of my time doing these. And we've got to be looking strategically at this. We've also got to be recycling the carbon. Again, the conversation we were having in the foyer before we came in. We've got to integrate fuel policies with other policies. If we are dealing with transport fuel and we are not thinking about what's happening in the electrical grid and what's happening in the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero and what's happening with DEFRA on air quality, then we're wasting our time. Develop the evidence base on the fuels. There are a lot of really silly things that are still obstacles on some of these fuels to do with warranties on engines, to do with legal positions and so on, that we just need to get task forces sorted on and get them sorted out. But the big one for me is at the bottom. We've got an existing infrastructure. It's a nightmare to try and do something on that scale all over again. We've got to leverage that in a strategic way and repurpose it. So, the statements that we made at the end of that report are that we think we need fuels and electrification. We think those are going to bump up and down in their relative importance in coming decades, and that those might be affected by things we're not anticipating at the moment, like geopolitical risk. You've got to mitigate risk. One of the things I learned when I was in the commercial sector, mostly working with banks on new technologies, is if you haven't mitigated the risk adequately, you will get absolutely nowhere with your technology. And we've got a load of options here and lots of people claiming different things. We've got to mitigate that risk by putting in place appropriate standards, frameworks, regulations, and plans. If I can show that I conform to what's expected nationally and internationally, then I'm halfway there to mitigating some of the risk. But security and resilience are increasingly important. And at the moment, the recommendation we made was that we still need to be taking multiple lines of approach. It isn't time at present to say electricity sits there, batteries sit there, and we'll never use them for this. That hydrogen is only for this, or ammonia only here. Actually, we don't know. I'm just showing a slide as I finish here of what I spent most of my time in my day job doing, which is running the National Biomass, Bioenergy, Biofuels Programme. The reason I show you this is there are several here that are very relevant to the fuels sector. There's work on aviation fuels, there's work on renewable dimethyl ether, there's work on biorefineries, bio-based chemicals. So there's a lot of activities and a lot of resource here on the fuels side that is incredibly relevant. You can find more there, but I hope we're going to have lots of discussions today where we explore some of that anyway. Thank you.